Okay, it's 2 o'clock. I'm getting the cue that it's good to begin. We're in recording progress. Welcome to the Louisiana Creole Research Association, also known as La Creole Special Program and Webinar Event. This is Josephine Dubuclet-Duque's Journey to Separate but Equal. My name is Chantel Nabon, and I am the current board chair. On behalf of our 8-member board, CREO's administration, and the entire organization, we are grateful to have you all here today. We hope that you enjoy this event, which is another opportunity for us to share free educational program for everyone. A special thank you and shout out goes to our subcommittee for organizing this spectacular event, and all of whom are members. So thank you to Julie Lee, who is a La Creole charter member, Mia James Alexis, who is a board member and our program's chair, to Mrs. Darlene Mason Williams, our programs committee person, and Helen Marie, La Creole's administrative manager and our tech guru, who's working diligently behind the scenes right now. And here we are once again fulfilling our mission by exploring and discovering and recognizing a remarkable history of our people, perhaps for some of us, our ancestors. So now I'm going to turn it over to Programs Chair Mia James Alexis, and she will introduce our guest panelists.
Thank you, Chantel. I am Mia James Alexis, Program Chair at La Creole, and I am pleased to introduce our author, Mr. Jack M. Bierman. Mr. Bierman is a professor of law and Harry Elwood Warner Scholar at Boston University of Law. He is an authority on the circumstances under which state and local officials and local governments should be held liable for their constitutional violations. He is the author of numerous articles on the legal history of the civil rights era and has authored or co-authored 4 books on administrative law. We are pleased to have him here today to discuss his current book, Separate but Equal, Madame Duque's Quest for Racial Justice in the Reconstruction Era. Next, our moderator is Ms. Julie Escherman Lee. She is a historian specializing in Louisiana and Pointe-Coupé history, spanning from the exploration to Reconstruction eras, 1690s through the 1880s. She is the founder and director of Creole West Productions, where she develops, authors, and produces projects that integrate innovative technology into edutainment, bringing history alive for all audiences. She designed and developed a model interactive local history website to benefit both middle school age Louisiana history students as well as users of various disciplines. Impassioned by her experience of her ancestors who were founding families of Louisiana and Pointe-Coupé, both free and enslaved, she conducts rigorous, well-documented research to retrace the footprints of Louisiana's past and its place in the larger spectrum of history. She is also a founding member of La Creole. Now, before I turn this over to our moderator, we would like this to be an interactive session. So if you have questions during the discussion period, please post them in the chat room and they will be addressed during the Q&A session. Now, I will turn the program over to Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mia. Comment ça va, everyone? Greetings from Pointe-Coupé Parish. And a huge thank you extends to La Creole for hosting this event. And of course, for all the hard work they put pulling it together. We really appreciate it. We also extend our deepest gratitude to each one of you that are participating this afternoon on this virtual webinar. I know as descendants, we're all really excited for Jack's work because he's taken it to the level past of back in the day with Mary Gaiman's book, who had first mentioned Josephine Dubuclet, and the case that we were all very curious to see really what happened all the way to the end. And y'all are going to see how Jack has done a comprehensive and and an amazing, he'll put us on an amazing journey of what happened. Like I said, it's of interest to both Dequee descendants. Today, that's pronounced more commonly as Dequeer, but it's actually, we were always corrected by our grandparents as Dequee, and then Dubuclet descendants as well, and as well as those that are interested in early civil rights in the United States. If you all would participate here, I'd like to take this opportunity to take a poll here before we get started. I wanted to see how many of you are related either to the Dequeer and or Dubuclet families. And you can go ahead and participate in this. Of course, it's something you may find out you're related after the fact. Now let me ask my host, would you all like me to continue to keep going and then this screen will just keep polling?
Yes, we're at about 80% of the participants have voted now.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll continue all. And we appreciate y'all participating in this poll. First of all, what I'll do to get us started is I'm going to set up the backstory of the time, place, and families up to 1871. And then Jack is going to piggyback, sharing his journey with the project and a comprehensive look at the case, the parties involved, and the how, why, and what happened that led directly to the court's adoption of separate but equal in Plessy v. Ferguson. Take a little step back in time, like I said, to set the stage. After a century as pawns of France and Spain, Louisianans now operated under the benefits of Americanization and a democratic government. This brought economic prosperity and a voice to white adult males through voting and holding elective offices. Trade increased and agricultural cultivation soared with the success of cotton and sugarcane crops. And with the two families that we're talking about, they were in two of some of the most successful parishes for that. In 1835, two well-respected and wealthy Louisiana Creole of color planter families, the Dequees and the Dubuclets, uniting two free people of color families who by 1860 were among the wealthiest planters and the largest slaveholders in the South of the United States. In early 1835, miners Antoine II Dequee was about 19-20, free man of color of Pointe-Coupee Parish, and Josephine Dubuclet, who's about 20, free woman of color of the neighboring Iberville Parish, formalized their commitment to be married at Josephine's mother's house in New Orleans. The widow Rosalie Belly Dubuclet, free woman of color, gave her permission for Josephine for marriage, and Antoine's parents, free people of color, Antoine Sr. and Poupon Decoud Dequee, represented Antoine. A formal marriage contract laid out the financial conditions of their future marriage. As children of Creole of color families, Antoine and Josephine were born into, actually for lack of a better description, the privileged class of Creoles of color. Each of their grandfathers, Joseph Dequee of Pointe-Coupee Parish and Pierre Belly of Iberville Parish, were white men. Both were well-respected, large slaveholding planters, held respectable positions in their communities, and served in the Spanish militia, as well as in Galvez's expedition against the British during the American Revolution, when Spanish Louisiana allied with the Americans on their fight for independence. Both men had relationships with women of color. Joseph with Francoise Chauvin-Beaulieu, a free woman of color from the Tchoupitoulas area just above New Orleans, which is Old Metairie today, and Pierre with his slave Rose, whom he had purchased from Jamaica. Pierre later freed Rose, elevating her status to a free woman of color. Although at the time in Louisiana laws and they were unable to legally marry, these two prominent men of Louisiana did everything legally allowable to legitimize their familial relationship with the mother of their children and their children. And these legal public actions laid the same foundation for the grandchildren and future generations whose civil rights, because they were free people of color, were not equal into what we'll see as well after the Civil War. Through public actions, Pierre and Joseph freed any of whom who were slaves, in Pierre's case, Rose, acknowledged their children as natural, donated in property and slaves to their natural children, as well as generous donations of property and slaves to their respective mothers. Albeit as Creoles of color, they had no civil rights, their grandfathers recorded legal public acts that gave them all legitimacy, independence, and economic status, as well as a claim to Joseph and Pierre's property upon their deaths. They all lived as a family. Their communities recognized them as such. And even on Joseph's Spanish militia record, actually, he was noted as being married. Convergence of these families through Antoine II and Josephine tied to other allied notable free people of colors, families such as Honoré, who was the Destrahans, the DeLongs, Ricard, Juge, Darensbourg, and Tournoir, just to name a few. After the couple married, they moved to Pointe-Coupee Parish, living among Antoine II's large group of Desquith family. They were early planters and large slaveholders of Lower False River and the Chenal Hermitage regions of the parish since the 1780s. His parents, Antoine and Poupon, had just built about around 1832 the large home that everybody today knows as Austerlitz. His uncle Loufois and their large family were all residing on and cultivating the large tract on Lower False River and the Chenal, all once owned by their father, Joseph, or Antoine and his grandfather. Having started their family, Antoine and Josephine were with their young children, Antoine III and Rosa, at the Chenal Hermitage plantation in 1850. Joseph Auguste was born a few years later. By 1855, Antoine and Josephine had lost all of their elders, their grandparents and their parents. As heir to his parents' Lower False River property, and now which Josephine was also entitled as being married, he, together with his uncle Loufois, who owned the adjoining piece, both divested themselves of the large plantations and numerous slaves, and they all moved permanently to the Chenal Hermitage plantations. Shortly after that sale, Josephine and the three children went to France, supposedly for both education and cultural reasons, as well as safety from the political discourse that was brewing at home. A number of Louisianans went to live and lived in France pre-Civil War, many of whom were our family members and many of whom they knew very well. Antoine stayed in Pointe-Coupee at the Hermitage plantation, handling all the operations. In 1860, he's noted on the census as age 54 at the Hermitage plantation alone, listed as a planter. The plantation was valued at $150,000. And at this point, he's noted also as one of the largest slaveholders in the South of the United States. He's residing next to his sister-in-law, Evelina Dubaclet Macias, and her husband, Manuel Macias. 3 years later, in 1863, the effects of the Civil War hit home in Pointe-Coupee. Union troops invaded the parish during various skirmishes outside of Baton Rouge and whatnot. And then in addition, the Union troops set up a large encampment taking over the Morganza plantation near New Texas Landing, which is Morganza today. The troops pilfered property and livestock and foodstuffs, wood from the buildings and fences throughout the parish, including the Desquith Hermitage plantation and store. Later, more than 65 claims for Pointe-Coupee were made before the Southern Claims Commission to recover value of what was taken. 1865 brought an end to the Civil War. It also brought an abrupt change to the lives of Josephine and her 3 children, who were coming home from France to get her husband, their father. On June 12, 1865, Antoine suddenly dies at his Hermitage plantation. A notice in a New Orleans paper reflects on his passing. Mr. A. Dequie, this respectable man, died the 12th of this month at the age of 50 years. Of course, he's about 54, on his plantation at Point Capay. All who knew him appreciated his joyful qualities. He died at the moment when his family was coming to make a tour of Europe, at the point when they were coming for him. What will the sorrow of his wife and their children be when they disembark at New Orleans and learn the news of the death of him who they loved and wished a long life? Mr. Antoine Dequie was widely admired by all classes of society. By his integrity and sophistication, he established here, meaning in New Orleans, as in Point Capay, a large circle of friends who will miss him forever. Coming home to be together abruptly flipped. Josephine, now widow Antoine Dequie, was thrown into the position as a grieving wife and mother, as administrators of the succession and all the complexities of settling the estate. In 1870, Josephine, widow Dequie, and her daughter Rosa are living at the Hermitage plantation. She's noted as a sugar planter, and the plantation is valued at $25,000. They were living next to her son Antoine III and his wife Virginie Boucher Dequie and their 2 children. Joseph Auguste was probably in New Orleans as he was living there previously and later as both an inventor and a portrait painter on Marigny Street. In the midst of widow Dequie's soldiering on to protect what she could for her and her children's future, 1868 brought a period of optimism among the divisiveness and loss of property and lives during the Civil War and the economic decline that followed. All men over the age of 21 were headed to their local courthouses to register to vote. Free people of color and ex-slaves for the first time. Although the economic decline after the Civil War was prevalent and Reconstruction brought many challenges, many of Josephine's free people of color male relatives became prominent members of the new order. Property and well-educated, they were able to become leaders in the struggle to bring equality to all Louisianans. And I'll run through the list just kind of quickly so that you all will recognize these folks, and Jack will be talking about a lot of these further. Republican Antoine Dubuclet Jr., who her brother was elected to state treasurer for 3 terms on the Republican ticket. Her cousin Pierre Delon was a delegate to the 1867 Constitutional Convention. He was also elected to the House of Representatives from 1868 to 1872. He was elected Secretary of State from 1872 to 1876. Prosper Darensbourg was elected to House of Representatives for 2 years from 1870 to 1872. Emile Honoré was elected to the House of Representatives for quite a long time. Gaston Dequire was elected as sheriff of Point Capay for 1 term, and then was candidate on the Republican ticket for Secretary of State in 1876. A.C. Tournois was elected to the House of Representatives for 4 years from 1868 to 1872, and he was publisher in 1871 of the first English newspaper in Point Capay, known as the Point Capay Republican. By the end of 1871, well, actually it was about end of 1871, the session proceedings wrapped up in Point Capay, which were one tremendous challenge after another, wrapped up after 6 years. The family support on both sides of the family was overwhelmingly steadfast throughout it all. However, at the end, the estate did not have enough value to cover all outstanding obligations, and all property was sold. Strong and relentless, the protracted experience was taking its toll on her physical, emotional, and mental well-being. It's 1872, and Josephine, the widow de Queer, Antoine, wasn't giving up. At this stage of the story, I'd like to pass the baton on to Jack. And Jack, I would like to ask you this before you present your remarkable findings of the widow Antoine de Queer's experience from this point forward. Please begin sharing with us how you became interested in this case.
Before we begin, I just wanted y'all to know that we did get our results in, and 34% of the participants did say that they're related to the family.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks to the Louisiana Creole Association and also to Julie. Julie was really helpful in helping me with this project. And as far as how I got into this project, it's about a dozen years ago. I was reading a law review article as part of my research about Southern Reconstruction politics, and I saw a citation to this decision, Hall versus DeQuee, in the Supreme Court, which said that Louisiana could not enforce its non-discrimination requirements on a riverboat on the Mississippi River because of Congress's exclusive authority over interstate commerce. And I was shocked because I had never heard of this case, and I've been studying for already decades the history of how the Supreme Court dismantled Congress's program of racial equality during Reconstruction. That the Congress kept passing these great civil rights statutes and the Supreme Court kept destroying them, either by holding them unconstitutional or by construing them very narrowly and such. But I had never heard of Hall versus DeQuee. So I started doing some research and I found the record in the case, and I read the record in the case. And then I said, well, you know, this case, it should be better known. It's hardly known at all among constitutional law scholars. There's a narrow slice of legal historians that know about it, but not really in the constitutional mainstream. And then I was told by one of these historians that there's a gap in the literature, that someone ought to write about this case. So I decided to do it. And it was my first project like this, to take a comprehensive view. And so one of the first things I did was I went to Louisiana to start doing research. And I reached out to Julie Lee, who's Creole West Productions, and some of her work is accessible on the internet. And I'm gonna go through a slideshow. And I hope you all can see my slide now. If you can't see my slide, someone please pipe up and let me know. So, and you'll notice that my title says equal but separate, and that's because of the phrasing of the actual Louisiana law that was upheld in Plessy versus Ferguson. Didn't say separate but equal, it said equal but separate. But my publisher insisted that I use separate but equal in the title because that's what people are familiar with. So anyway, so when I went down to Louisiana the first time, Julie took me to see Austerlitz Plantation, which this is a photo I took of it, which is, as she mentioned, that's the first place that Antoine II and Josephine Dubuclet lived together as husband and wife. And I was just amazed at the beauty of the place. And then turning your back on that, that's what it looked like looking out at the False River. And I have to say, though, that the most interesting thing about the project, other than the legal provisions, was just learning about the people that were involved in this and the people that consider themselves Creole and that are called Creole. Now, I didn't really know how to use the word Creole, so I decided not to use it. And I talk in the book a little bit about why I decided not to use it, because there's so many different definitions of it. But I got very interested in learning more about the families. So after about 10 or 12 years working on the project, the book came out finally on April 7th. And it was, as I said, it was my first project like this. Had I been doing it today, I might have been able to finish it a little more quickly. And as I said, Julie's help was just immeasurable. So when I started learning about the family, I stumbled upon this booklet, which was prepared for a DeQuee family reunion in 1995. And you see written by Randy DeQuee and someone else. And this shows a church that Albert DeQuee helped establish in Pointe-Coupé. Now, as Julie talked about a little bit, what I learned was that there were many more free people of color in Louisiana than in other places in the United States through a combination of factors. One was that many escaped Haiti after the revolution there and came. Many were freed by their owners and I always put owners in quotation marks because I feel uncomfortable with the actual idea that one person can actually own another person. And people also purchased their freedom, which was allowed under French law. French and Spanish law of slavery was somewhat more liberal than the American law. The liberality really was cracked down upon once the Americans took over. And then Albert de Quilly's grandsons, Joseph and Antoine, established long-term relationships with free women of color. And so they were not people of color, but their wives, although they really couldn't marry because marriage was illegal under the Black codes. Their wives, though, that they lived with as wives and had children with, as Julie explained, they lived openly as mixed race couples. And so there was just a diversification in racial terms of the de Quilly family and other families. And many of the de Quillys, of course, lived together in this area, which is now the Lower False River. And the other thing that we heard about in history is this notion of plissage, which is that there was sort of a bargaining relationship between a mother and a man to place their daughter with a wealthy white person in a long-term domestic relationship. And some people think this is a myth, that it didn't really happen this way. But of course, Antoine II and Josephine did not and were not product of any of this sort of machinations. Their families somehow knew each other, and the marriage was arranged between Antoine and Josephine's brother, Antoine Dubuclet Jr. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the status of these people, and again, because the people aspect was so fascinating. This is a legal paper in which Antoine de Quilly sued Victor Superneuf. And the two interesting things about this legal paper: this lawsuit was initiated in 1847. It has nothing to do with this story that I'm telling, but it's interesting. First of all, you notice that the top of the form has English and the bottom of the form has French, which was the common thing in Louisiana at that time. The other thing is, every time Antoine de Quilly's name appears, you see the letters FMC, and the same with Victor Superneuf, FMC. And their names appear multiple times on the document. And the reason was because legally they were required to designate themselves as free men of color. The racial line, legally, the legal racial line was very well established. And so everyone had to know who they were talking about. Okay, so now to talk a little bit more specifically, and Julie gave you some of these details. So Josephine's family, and the Dubuclet name is less famous than the de Quilly name only because the case is de Quilly. But her family on the maternal side, Pierre Bely, came with his slave wife Rose from Jamaica to Louisiana. And so that was Josephine's grandmother. She was emancipated in 1802, and along with her four oldest daughters who were born slaves. On the paternal side, the Bely's sixth daughter, Rosalie, married Josephine's grandfather, Antoine Dubuclet Sr. in 1798. And Dubuclet's father was a free planter. And so that's how that's the maternal and paternal side of her family. And all of the people that they traced directly were free, except of course for Rose, who was a slave until her husband freed her in Louisiana in 1802. And this is a tomb of the Ricard family tomb, which includes the Belys in St. Raphael Cemetery in Iberville Parish. And this is a beautifully constructed tomb. And on the side, there's multiple plaques, including on the left, you see Pierre Bely and Rose Bely. And you see it says, it's in French, but it says that he was born in France and she was born in Jamaica, and has their dates. And then you see Cyprien Ricard, who I know is also a very well-known family leader. His remains are in there. And so that's just what these beautiful tombs look like. These people were very conscious of their status. Okay, and here's a photo of Josephine's brother, Antoine. I would have had photos in the book, but for the fact that there's no photo or drawing, as we know, of Josephine. And we keep hoping one will show up, especially since her son was a well-known portrait artist. But so that's Antoine Dubuclet, and he was a remarkable person. He was the treasurer of Louisiana in the post-Civil War period for 6 years, I believe. And the Democrat racists kept trying to kick him out, but he was so good at it, they kept him. And finally, they couldn't put up with the idea of a man of color being the treasurer anymore. And so they kicked him out and the Democrat took over. And within a couple of years, less than a couple of years, he cleaned out the treasury and ran away to Central America, never to be heard of again, and lived out his life as a fugitive from Louisiana justice. So now is, and here, by the way, here's the Dubuclet family tomb in St. Louis Cemetery #1 in New Orleans. I have no idea whether her remains are in there or his remains, her brother's, but this is a Dubuclet family tomb in that cemetery that I visited. Okay, so as Julie told you, her husband died in 1865, and she was appointed the administratrix of his succession. And this is the paper doing that, and she signed it, Mrs. Antoine Dupuy, and no longer, of course, FWC, because everyone was free by that time. And so there was no need for that racial designation. And it mentions her minor children, that Rosa and Auguste were still minors at the time. And she promises to do her job as administratrix to preserve the estate. And so what happened was she was dissatisfied with how things were going in the estate, and it dragged on and dragged on. And then finally, by 1871, she basically came away with nothing. And she got suspicious that maybe her lawyers, a pair of lawyers from New Roads, weren't treating her properly and were in collusion with the claimants against the estate. So possibly at the urging of her brother, she went to New Orleans and sought out a new lawyer. And she came to a fellow's office named E.K. Washington. And E.K. Washington was born a Northerner, but he had moved to Louisiana sometime before and actually served in the Confederate Army. And he claimed a familial relationship to George Washington through a cousin, Lund Washington. And this piece of paper you see is a page from a divorce case he was involved in. He was involved in a terrible, long, lengthy divorce proceedings. And here he claims to have a familiar relationship with George Washington. So she goes to his office, possibly because he was practicing together with a fellow named Seymour Rene Snare, who was a free man of color before the Civil War and had read the law to learn how to be a lawyer with Simeon Belden, who had been the Attorney General of Louisiana. And he was a very, very smart person from a distinguished family. And his birth name was actually Rene Seymour Snare, but he changed it to Seymour Rene because Rene was based on he was named after the pirate Rene Beluche, who supposedly smuggled the family from Cuba into the United States. So he was, and in the book you see many more details about both of these lawyers, including an episode in which Snare saves the killers of one of his brothers from being lynched, only to have them lynched once he leaves, after he had become the attorney, the state's attorney for parishes near New Orleans. Now, Snare's family there's been a book written about Snare's family by a distinguished historian named Mary Frances Berry, who at one time was chairwoman of the United States Civil Rights Commission. And one of the people was his brother. His brother was a war hero who was seriously wounded in the Civil War and also served in the legislatures in Louisiana during the time period that Julie was speaking about, when the Louisiana legislature enacted civil rights provisions. And Lewis ultimately left Louisiana and went to California, and he lived out the rest of his life as a white person. But he was a very well-known figure in Louisiana. So now this is a page from the New Orleans Picayune, and it shows the advertisement for the Governor Allen, which is the boat that she and her lawyer Washington took to go up to Point Coupé to look at court records to help her in her case. And on the right is the beginning of her complaint, which I'll explain in a minute. When she got to they met at the levee, and Washington bought tickets on the Governor Allen, whose captain was John Benson, and that's who she sued. The case became Hall versus Dupuy after Captain Benson died while the case was pending in the U.S. Supreme Court, and his widow was substituted as the defendant. They got married, and then he died 9 days after that. Anyway, they get to the levee, and Madame Dupuy goes on the boat, and she's waiting for her lawyer, and she's sitting in the area reserved for white ladies. And Snare sees Washington back out on the levee because he's looking for Snare to get on the boat with them. And he says, "Oh, she's not going to like that boat." And he says, "I'm taking another boat." So Washington then goes back on the boat to try to get her off the boat, and he can't do it because the boat leaves. And so they take this boat, the Governor Allen, from, now you see in this, the New Orleans is at the bottom right and New Roads is at the top left, but they actually would have gotten off in the channel area at Hermitage Landing on the sort of to the east of New Roads. And this is the area where you see the False River, New Roads, and you see the channel, which now is sort of, it's probably along what's known as Highway 414 from the river over to the New Roads area. And just for reference, the Austerlitz plantation is down in what's called Oscar there, which is a hamlet down in the lower False River area. So she gets on the boat, and she they will not accommodate her in the area reserved for white ladies. And Washington begs people on the boat several times, and there's a lot of details about this in the book also, but the answer is final. She sits up in the back of the boat, in the back of the area where the ladies are, in a public area all night, because the trip is 17 hours on the river. And she is offered a meal, but she declines it. And so, and it turned out that this was the third time, by the way, that she had refused to go into the area that was reserved for people of color, which the boat captains called the Bureau, which was sort of a sarcastic reference to the Freedmen's Bureau. So anyway, so at the time that she was traveling, though, the Louisiana Constitution prohibited any discrimination in conveyances of a public character, which the Governor Allen certainly was. And then there was a statute which said that although boat owners, as always, could make rules and regulations for their boat and can exclude people who are behaving improperly or won't pay the fare, the statute specifically said that the rules and regulations must make no discrimination on account of race or color. And this was during this brief period between the end of the Civil War and the end of Reconstruction, when many of the Southern governments had relatively liberal racial policies because the governments were dominated by Republicans and people of color. It wasn't until the violent overthrow of those governments and the Supreme Court's later decisions that these laws went out of existence. So she within a few days of her arrival in Pointe-Coupee Parish, her lawyers filed this complaint on her behalf. Now, there was a well-known case brought by the civil sheriff of Orleans Parish, Charles Sauvanet, who had won a case and was awarded $1,000 for the refusal of the Bank Coffee House in the French Quarter, or just outside the French Quarter, to serve him because he was a person of color. And he had been served for years in all places, but the color line was hardening in this period because there was a great deal of racial strife and there was race riots going on. And so he had been awarded $1,000. They probably knew about it. It was probably a notorious case. So her lawyers that she had originally hired for work on the estate end up suing. And this is her petition, Madame, it says the petition of Madame Antoine Decuy, who resides in the parish of Pointe-Coupee. It begins, it's handwritten. In those days, they were all handwritten. And that's the first page of the original complaint. And here's the end of it. And you see it's signed by Seymour Snare and E.K. Washington. And I'm not sure who wrote this, who actually did the handwritten complaint. I can't tell from the handwriting, but one of the two of them wrote it out and filed it in the district court in New Orleans. And here's here's the receipt for her freight, because she had brought a trunk with her, and this is attached to the complaint that she filed. And these papers, by the way, the trial court papers were all located. They're all located in the New Orleans Public Library, and the librarians there were very helpful to me. And her brother was the security. And when you sued someone in those days, you had to post a bond in case you lost, and costs were awarded against you. And so her brother's signature, because he was so wealthy, even then was enough to satisfy the lawyers on the other side that there was security. So that's his signature. I am security for cash in the above captioned suit. Okay, so she sues, and she says that she was humiliated by her treatment. And there were several other people of color, cousins and associates, testified that they were humiliated by their treatment, and this bureau was inferior, far inferior to the area for white people. There was no separation of sexes, And it was a place, one of them called it a place where animals are penned up. Now, there was also some very odd testimony about people's racial identity. And they asked people, and I was thinking about reading some of this, but it would take too long. But there's testimony about how curly their hair is, what makes them look like a person of color. And really the answer is, they say it's native intuition and it's reputation in the community that determines whether you're a person of color or not. And Washington himself testified that he regretted that Madame de Quie was on the boat, and he tried to keep her off. And I think he didn't want other lawyers and judges to think that he was trying to stir up this racial conflict at this time. And this was a very treacherous time in the history of Louisiana, with numerous battles resulting in the deaths mainly of people of color. Now, the defense didn't dispute that she was segregated into this area, and they claimed that they treated the people of color as well as white people. And they also said that no white people would travel with them without this segregation, and that it was the universal custom on the riverboat. So anyway, so this case, and the defendants make a claim in the case that the custom of universal segregation should prevail over that law, and that and they also originally claimed that it would violate the U.S. Constitution to apply Louisiana law on the river. And that's a very technical doctrine known as the Dormant Commerce Clause. And there had only been 2 cases decided on that basis in the history of the United States, very recent during that period when Madame de Quie sued in 1872. And the trial judge who heard the case decided in her favor. And he was a Democrat. He had been a leading Democrat speaker. He was a white supremacist, but he felt that as a judge, his duty was to follow the law. And he said the law is that on her side. And then he expresses in this last paragraph of his opinion, which I use as the epigram of my book, he says that he really hopes that cases like this won't arise in the future, because this is all about prejudice, and that we should all unite in our shared American citizenship, and wish that that were true even today with all the conflict we have in this country over basic principles of human rights. Anyway, so his decision gets appealed by the defendant to the Supreme Court of Louisiana, and Justice Ludeling, a well-known Republican, is the Chief Justice. The court, not unanimously, but the court finds in her favor. And Judge Collum had awarded her $1,000 because he said, we don't want to make this a windfall. And the $1,000 seems to have been like the going rate for cases like this. But the Supreme Court actually said, if she had asked, we might have given her more money. But Ludeling was a very well-known politician. A couple of times he had to hide for his life during racial conflict and political conflict. One of his sons was murdered by the owners of a neighboring plantation because he had hired some black workers away from that plantation. Even though they were free, the custom was you had to get the permission of their former owners to do this, because across the South, the former slave owners were trying to keep their former slaves in as close to slavery as possible during this period. So he gets affirmed. He affirms the trial court. And then the defense gets really scared, and all of the boat owners join together and hire a lawyer named Robert H. Marr. And Robert H. Marr was one of the most well-respected, well-known Democratic politicians in Louisiana at this time, at least in the New Orleans area. And he later became a judge of the Supreme Court. His son became district attorney for Orleans Parish. He was in the Supreme Court of Louisiana. He also died in mysterious consequences. He disappeared one day while walking on the levee, and some people claimed to have him hostage as a kidnapping, but that was never borne out. He was one of the lawyers who he was a politician who fomented some of the race riots, including the Battle of Liberty Place. Where dozens of blacks were killed. He also represented the defendants who were prosecuted by the federal government for their role in the Colfax riot, which was a massacre of dozens of people by white invaders who were taking over the government by force. And he had won that case, so I think they hired him. And he argued passionately to the Supreme Court of the United States that they could not apply this Louisiana law on the Mississippi River because it was under federal control. And the Supreme Court of the United States agreed with him. Chief Justice Morrison Waite, a moderate Republican, wrote the opinion saying basically from the white point of view that it would be too difficult because if one state required segregation and another state required integration, they'd all have to change when they cross the borders. And he says, and he looks at it from the white point of view. And this is a quote from the opinion: a passenger in the cabin set apart for the use of whites must, when the state comes within, share that cabin with such colored persons that may come on afterwards if this law is enforced. Now, before we go on, we have another poll. What do you think the vote was in the Supreme Court of the United States? There were 8 justices on the Supreme Court. So we have a poll. Is someone going to launch the poll? I thought we were going to have a poll at this point. There we go. How do you think it was? Was it a unanimous decision or was it a split decision? Okay, good. I see most people are going for a split decision. Oh, see, I'm going to continue while you're all still voting, and you can see that it's looking about 3-1. People think that the decision was split. Well, actually, both people are right. Both of you are right. And how can that be? Well, when the court voted on the case, and it voted on the case in October of 1877, I can't advance my, oh, there we go. So the final poll was about 70-30. So I think we can take off the poll now. So what happened was when the court actually voted on the case, 3 justices voted to affirm the Louisiana court and 5 justices voted to reverse. But when the decision came out, it was unanimous. There were no dissents noted. Now, the great crusader for equal rights, John Marshall Harlan, was about to become the 9th justice. And I imagine that if he had come on the court by then, he would have dissented. Okay, so this, and what's notable about this case, of course, is that for the first time, the Supreme Court seemed to endorse racial segregation. And you know, that by suggesting that another state could have the requirement that they be segregated. So that was pretty disheartening. And the reaction to the decision was really vocal. This book was written by a press published by the press called the Negro Universities Press. And it mentioned the case more than 100 times about how terrible this was, that the Supreme Court had abandoned the people of color in their time of need when they needed the protection of the law because they were being chased out of all government and economic positions by violence by the democratic white supremacists who were retaking all the governments in the South. And even in the South, some judges willfully misrepresented the case and said that it stood for the proposition that carriers can segregate, which it didn't say. It said basically that state law could not require integration. But this decision says that the state law, that the law of Hall versus DeQuee allowed for segregation, which wasn't really strictly true. And then now, while the case was pending, Congress had passed one of its most far-reaching civil rights laws, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited across the United States any racial segregation in any public facility. And so the justices knew that that law was in effect at that time, but they figured, well, in the next case, it'll come out differently maybe, except that the justices had a plan. And so in 1883, the Supreme Court struck that law down as beyond Congress's power, which meant at this point that neither the federal government nor the state governments could outlaw segregation in travel. Okay, and so that was part of the Supreme Court's dismantling of civil rights. And then in 1890, over the objections of the community of people of color in Louisiana, Louisiana passed what was known as the Separate Cars Act, which said that all railroads must provide equal but separate accommodations. And so this group called the Citizens Committee brought a test case, and it was a united group. Both the sort of gens de couleur, the higher class, light-skinned people, and the freedmen and their community joined together. They wrote a lengthy argument against this law. And then now Judge Marr was declared dead while this was all going on, and he was replaced on the court by a judge named Ferguson, who presided over Homer Plessy's trial and found him guilty. And so the case ended up being a suit against the judge for finding him guilty. And it ends up in the Supreme Court under the name Plessy versus Ferguson. And the Supreme Court upheld this separate car act and said that equal but separate was consistent with equal protection of the laws. And that's just, that was the beginning of Jim Crow and the end of really any hope that the Supreme Court was going to help the people of color of anywhere in the South, including the people in Louisiana, with their to protect their civil rights. And of course, it took a long time later when we had Brown versus Board of Education in the 1950s, which reversed separate but equal, and the Supreme Court stopped allowing this. Now, I want to talk about the last thing I want to say is to mention this debate. There's a debate among historians, and I read deeply in it when I was preparing for this project, about whether if the Supreme Court would have gone the other way, would it have actually made a difference? Would white supremacist resistance have been so strong that no Supreme Court decisions requiring integration would have been enforced? Would there have been another civil war, an uprising? What would have happened? And some historians say, no, it would have been difficult, but we wouldn't have had Jim Crow, and things would have gotten better much more quickly. And others say, no, that it wouldn't have been enforceable and it would have been terrible. Now, obviously, this is a question that we'll never be able to actually answer. But my next book, which I've completed, and is a fictional account of the 19th century Supreme Court, with the notion that they tried to protect civil rights, and they allied with Congress in protecting people's civil rights. Now, I don't want to give away that book. Hopefully will come out sometime in the future, although I still don't have a publisher for it. It's fiction, and it's a lot harder to get fiction placed with a publisher than nonfiction like this book. But that's a question that continues to haunt historians, whether the Supreme Court really could have stopped Jim Crow dead in its tracks, or whether we were doomed regardless because of the Southern white supremacy. And with that, I'm finished. I will stop sharing my screen, and I'm hoping to hear, I think we're going to have a little bit of a comment from one of the people from the society, the association, and then I'm hoping to have questions from you all who have been so patient listening to me, and I really appreciate your attention and your interest in this project. Thank you.
So, Julie, I don't know if you want to come on to assist with the question and answer session here. We haven't had any questions in the chat room, but and Miss Christina Ruge did mention that she is not related to the family. However, she lives in a Sazion house, which she believes was originally owned by the Decay family. Let me find that real quick. She says it's on Chanel Road. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I can check into it further if she wants to kind of write me privately afterwards, and I can follow up on that for her.
Okay. But we didn't have any more questions in there, but I think you had some things that you wanted to point out.
I did see one question in the chat about her original lawyers. Right, someone
Okay, did it just
someone
come
asked
up?
if we know who were.
Come through, but go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't see it. Okay.
I saw a question.
Yes, it was about Mr. Quees going to court, and do we know who her attorneys were?
Yeah, so her original attorneys were Harrelson and Claiborne from New Roads, Point Coupé Parish. And I have in the book, I include a little bit of history of them. They were an interesting pair. They both went on to distinguished careers, but they seemed to be the lawyers that a lot of people in her group, a lot of the people of color would use. I don't think they were people of color, but a lot of the people in probably her family and her social class and economic class would use as their sort of day-to-day business lawyers and such. And so they ran the succession on her behalf as lawyers. And so when Washington, when they went on the boat, the purpose was to go up to Point Coupé to look in the courthouse and maybe to go to their office and get the court records to see if there was anything they could do, that Washington and Snare could do to to try to help her recover more money. Now, I also saw a question. Somebody asked if she testified in any of the court cases. So I'm unaware of. She never testified in this case. Actually, her words come through her complaint, and she was not even present for most of the testimony in the case. In fact, I don't exactly understand why, but most of the actual testimony was taken in the defense lawyer's office. The defense lawyer was a fellow named Bentinck Egan, who was a very well-known commercial lawyer, admiralty lawyer in New Orleans during this period, very well respected. So they took most of the testimony in his office. And I don't exactly know why. There's one proceeding in open court where they take some testimony, and Washington says on the record that they had hoped she would be in court that day, but she wasn't. So they had been expecting her. Now, there's a sense that she was in very poor health, both physical and mental, during this period. Certainly, she was very dispirited, and I think she was reluctant to sort of make a public appearance, it seems like. But she gave a pretty eloquent testimony through the complaint itself, which talks about how she was humiliated by her treatment. She was insulted. She was exposed to vulgar language by the crew, and she couldn't be undressed in private to go to sleep. And she also said in the complaint, by the way, that she had never been treated this way by a boat owner before, which was not true, because there's testimony that this was the third time she refused to go into the bureau on a boat, and but maybe the third time was just too much. Okay, now there was a couple other questions. Would you like me to just keep going and answer the questions?
Well, yeah, if you could see what I see, someone's acknowledging that they're a descendant and have done some research into the case and community as an undergrad. And they're asking Professor Bierman, in your research, did free women of color interact differently with the law and litigation than free men of color at this time?
You know, I don't really know much about the difference between men and women of color at this time. I would say that when you go back in the courts in Louisiana, there's much more litigation where people of color are active, because there were so many more people of color who were engaged in business activities in Louisiana than in most other places in the United States. I mean, there were some everywhere, but in many areas, most of the litigation when people of color brought cases in the slavery period was about their status as free or slave, and then in attempting to inherit based on the claim that they were free. But I didn't notice there has been some written about the fact that there were some very active women business people in this period who brought a lot of cases. There's a case involving a woman named Gaines, who must have been at the Supreme Court 7 or 8 times over an inheritance dispute, a woman from Louisiana. Woman of color. So, but I didn't notice any really systematic differences between litigation by free men of color. Okay, there's more questions.
Yes. Okay, there's an author of the book Economy Hall, which mentions the reasons for many of the racial riots in cases like Plessy. Are you familiar with the book Economy Hall?
Not that I recall.
Brotherhood.
I read a lot of work for this.
Okay. Well,
and I'm not sure about that, but the race riots were just amazing all across the South, but really in Louisiana, it seemed like it was worse than everywhere else. And Congress had a lot of evidence of this when they were passing repeated civil rights laws to try to protect the people.
okay.
So someone asked, do I think this case will enter into the mainstream records so to be more well known? Well, I'm proud of one thing. I have a colleague who's actually very conservative. He's one of the founders of the Federalist Society, believe it or not. He just published a constitutional law casebook, which is a textbook used by students in law school, along with another founder of the Federalist Society, and they included this case in the book. And it was really because I made them aware of it. So I'm happy about that maybe the case will become a little bit more well known. But it certainly is something that it's a surprising gap in our understanding of the constitutional history.
I've noticed some questions about where where we, what resources that we used, particularly on the family and whatnot. I can tell you that my approach is always the original records, where you look at the original baptismal, death, marriage records, the original records in the respective courthouses. And you always want to look at that because many people will go through parts and bits and parts of maybe these families or the case or whatever, and some, very well-known academics, and they'll look at it for particular reasons. And what I've found by going back to the original records and actually translating them myself is that there's errors just because it's misunderstood, because perhaps those people aren't aware of the parties, or they're sort of making assumptions or whatever. So I would always suggest to always address the original records and analyze them yourself. So that's been my approach, and that's where I get my information. The second question about that was, are a lot of these available online? Unfortunately, they're not. In Louisiana, a lot of the original records in the courthouses and whatnot are still in the courthouses. A lot of the clerk of courts are looking to the point where they can actually get them scanned and put online. I'm working actually on a side project with the University of Berkeley team, where we're trying to get at least the indexes to the records put on an online database, so that folks all over the world will know at least sort of where to start with the needle in the haystack, so that they would know what volume to go to or what record to request. And we're in the process of that. We're only up to about 1830, but they're doing a marvelous job. But and then I'll go back to Jack, and Jack has done the same thing. He actually went directly to the records and looked at them again, the ones that I had copies of, and then were the ones that he looked at. So when you say, Jack, that's always the best approach, is you've got to look at it yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I did rely on Julie for some of the things that were really not discoverable, because I didn't have even the ability to read French and to go into the courthouse in Point Coupé Parish. But I did go to the courthouses, and I got original records, that birth and death records, when I could. So I did as much original research as I could, and especially for me, it was the court cases that were the things that I really wanted to see. But I found as much as I could, and I have to say that it was very confusing, because there's so many people named Dupuy, and so many people, so many Antoines, and so many Josephs, and so many different branches of the family that were all sort of living in the same area at the same time. So it was very hard, and Julie was invaluable at helping me sort it out. And so that was really helpful. But yeah, and people make errors. Like, there's a few things written, and if you don't go back to the original source, you'll make errors. Like, for example, there's one article, which is a pretty good article about the case, which talks about Madame Dupuy's testimony. Of course, she didn't testify. So that's something that, if you looked at the original transcript, and I've seen, actually, there's a handwritten version of the transcript, which was provided to the Supreme Court of Louisiana. And then there's right at that time, the Supreme Court of the United States required that all transcripts be printed. That was for the first time right in that time period. So there's a printed one too, which is available online. So I actually, there was a couple of times when I couldn't read things or I thought something was wrong in the printed version, and I went back and looked at the handwritten version, and I got it right from the handwritten version, that the transcription was incorrect. So now, a couple other questions, that were the debts against her husband's succession legitimate? I would say probably yes, because the economy was destroyed by the Civil War, and the combination of just the economic devastation and the fact that everything of value was taken from the plantation by the Union Army, and then also the loss of the value of slaves, and there would have been loans that maybe used slaves even as security. Among all the things that were going wrong economically, many people at that time period were suffering similarly economically. So probably the debts were legitimate, and there were people that were sort of leaders of the group who had the biggest claims against the estate. Antoine, her husband, probably was borrowing money to keep afloat at the end.
A lot of the debts too were, he was looked at as sort of of course, the wealthiest one, and for all the cousins and everything at the time, and the ones that had the smaller farms, he was lending money to family members and whatnot. And he was also getting money from family in New Orleans, you know, to send over to Josephine and the family. And I think it just kind of all, the economy just all kind of came crashing. And at the end, you know, there just wasn't enough to cover it. So I personally, because I've looked at that secession thoroughly, I personally feel that the claims were legitimate. Now, her question about it may be coming from a perspective of she wasn't here, you know, so she wasn't that involved in what was going on. So I think she thought that was kind of her last shot, you know, and perhaps if some of those claims weren't viable, you know, that she could recover something. So,
So someone asked about press reaction.
Yeah, backlash from the press, and at the same voice, you know, were people condemned or shunned for speaking up?
Well, so this was such a, by 1872, there was so much racial violence going on. The white supremacists basically were pulling out all the stops and trying to retake all the Southern governments. Two governments, Louisiana's and South Carolina's, were actually taken by force. There were coups where the state houses were invaded by armed Democrats to kick the Republicans out of office. And so, and the white press was pretty unanimous, except for the Republican press. But you know, you risked getting killed if you spoke out. You risked getting killed if you voted Republican. There were parishes in Louisiana where in the election in 1870, it might be 95% Republican votes, and the next election be 100% Democratic votes, because people risked being killed. So the press, I can tell you that I saw many press accounts which referred to these anti-discrimination laws as abominations. And, you know, every right-thinking, I remember, you know, every right-thinking person would condemn these laws as unwise. So the white, you know, establishment press was certainly against them. There were Republican press that were in favor of them, and there was some papers published by people of color who were in favor of them. And, you know, there was, when this case was decided, there was coverage which was, you know, bemoaning the loss in the case. And, but the white establishment press was very strongly against. There were accounts of this case which basically just said, you know, thank goodness that the Supreme Court did the right thing. Now, someone asked me a really important question: where is the book available? And the answer is it's available from, you know, Amazon and from the University Press of Kansas. And I also set up my own website, jackbierman.com. The publisher gives me books, and if you want it, I can inscribe them and send them. You can find it on my website, jackbierman.com, and you can, you know, and I can send them directly. I mean, it's such a shame that we're not in person here doing this together. And, you know, that's the thing. I love the idea of signing books for people, but since I can't do it in person, I'm doing it virtually, and I can sign the book in my home and send it out.
We'll have some references to being able to obtain your book, so that'll be shared in a moment. And I know that we're a little bit beyond 3 o'clock, but just for historical note, and we were talking about the process. One of our attendees wrote that another Pointe Coupee resident, Adoria Honoré, who was born Dupuis, was married to Emile Honoré, and Emile wrote 2 great poems that appeared in Lyon and the New Orleans Tribune, which were Black publications. Captain Andre Caillou and his comrades in arms appeared in Lyon, and the Blacks' Right to Vote appeared in the Tribune.
Yeah. Shall I continue answering questions, or?
wonderful.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yes, one more. Are we good with one more? Has there been any known research of free people in color of Louisiana versus other Southern states?
Yeah, there are a lot of resources about the free people of color of Louisiana, including, now I'm forgetting, Julie, you may remember, someone who wrote this book, My People, about my
Rudolph Desdunes.
yeah, right. Rodolphe Desdunes wrote a beautiful sort of tribute to the people of color of Louisiana, the French-speaking people, which was very helpful to me in trying to understand the people. And someone asked the question, if you don't mind, how prevalent were these types of cases? And the answer is that there were dozens and dozens of cases challenging transportation segregation all across the United States. And mainly, though, they were people claiming either that they should have been treated as white or that they were not treated equally. that they were unjustly, they would buy a first class ticket and be put it like in a second class smoking car with their wives and families, and that was not proper. So there were many of these cases. I think I once had a stack of hundreds of them.
Let me piggyback on one of the questions I think they had asked. Were there a lot of these cases in Louisiana? And I think the question actually was, and other southern states, have people studied that about free people of color? Actually, they have. You can look at Lauren Schwenninger has spent a lot of time doing a database on free people of color, and Ira Berlin, that whole group of folks. There's some folks that have done some PhDs and that kind of stuff where they're comparing the free people of color in the southern states, and it's all been basically kind of on an academic basis.
Yeah, there's one book about streetcar. There's a book with The Right to Ride by someone named Blair Kelly, which is about streetcar boycotts during this period. Very interesting also.
Okay. Mia, would you like to rejoin? And Mr. Bierman, we have your book information on screen now for everybody.
Great, thank you. There was New Orleans had segregated streetcars after the Civil War, and it was called the Star Car system. And basically, the people rose up against it and prevented it from going forward. So there was a popular uprising against segregation on the streetcars, and so there was that was something that happened in the Reconstruction era, and it happened in some other places also.
Were there two other people that had a question from what I'm noticing?
Well, we saw some raised hands, but I believe that's about.
That's it. Okay. All right.
Yes, I'm going to ask Mia to rejoin.
Yes, and again, in my closing remarks, I'll tell you how to address any questions that you have after the fact, because I know there's a lot of questions, and currently we can't get to them all, and we do apologize. But as I'm doing my closing remarks, please take a few seconds to fill out the short survey you see on the screen. In case you don't finish or wish to add comments, you will have another opportunity when you receive the thank you email from La Creole, as well as any direct questions you can send directly to Ms. Julie Eshelman Lee. I would like to thank Mr. Bierman and Ms. Lee for taking time out today to share their expertise on this intriguing subject. And I do have a surprise for everyone. Our author, Mr. Bierman, has graciously provided La Creole an autographed copy of his book as a giveaway today. So please finish filling out your surveys. We need to get that done quickly, because how this will work is that we've actually put everyone's name who registered for this event in a wheel that we will spin. But the caveat is you must be present to win. When your name is called, you will have 15 seconds to type your name in the chat room, and we are monitoring it so that we can verify the winner. And from that point, we will need your address as well as your email address so that we can get the book out to you. 1 second. I have to get the survey off my screen. 1 second, guys. Okay. So Helen, would you like to pull up the wheel?
Sure. I'm going to, I don't know if I can let it continue going. We've got about 58% of people who have filled out the survey. So I'm going to just go ahead and.
Someone commented that there were only 2 questions that were seen on the survey and it wouldn't advance. I don't know if that was one person's issue or for many.
Yeah, there's a total of 5. You may need to scroll up to see the remaining questions.
Some people may have missed the survey.
Well, like I said, we are going to send an email tomorrow that will have another opportunity for you to give feedback. And yeah, So in case you.
All
you
right.
haven't been able to.
So thank you for all who were able to participate, but it'll come back to you in email.
Yes.
All right.
Now we'll get the wheel up and running.
Still running.
All right, great.
Just a sec.
Chantel, the recording will be posted in that follow-up email, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes,
Yes.
in the follow-up emails for everyone's information, there will be a link to the recording. There will also be a link to information to Mr. Beersman's book and his website, as well as an email address to Ms. Lee if you have any direct questions regarding the family or the book. If you can send directly to her.
All right. You all
All
see the
right.
wheel? Oh, wow.
All right, boys.
Oh,
Are you here?
Beauchamp Bird. All
So
right.
if Mara
Beauchamp
Bird is here, please type your name in the chat room. You have 15 seconds to do so.
Not seeing the name. I'm looking at the list.
Yeah, I don't see her name.
Dr. Bird, yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh,
Oh,
You can-
spin again, huh?
Then
Yeah.
again,
okay.
yeah, this wheel is hilarious. Thanks, Fatima.
We had a lot of people that registered.
Yeah.
Are you President Sandra?
Swanberg. Tandra Swanberg. I don't believe I saw that name.
I didn't see that.
I
name.
don't remember.
Okay, we'll keep.
And again,
One more. We'll
Yeah.
try again. We'll keep trying till we get somebody that's here.
yeah, remove her name and spin to the next one because you have to be present to win.
Yeah, thank you all for hanging in. The wheel is making up names. No, these are people that registered, but they didn't necessarily join.
Oh, Melissa. Okay.
Oh, Melissa Ware, Melissa Daggett. I think that's, yeah. Melissa, can you respond? Melissa, she did respond.
Awesome.
Melissa
All
says
right.
yay.
Yay.
Congratulations.
Melissa, can you actually direct an email to the panelists where you will give us your complete mailing address and email address, please, so that we can get the book to you? And to continue on with my closing remarks, the vision of La Creole is that our history and culture is understood and shared around the world. So we want to thank our presenters again for sharing their vision. Visit our website at lacreole.org or follow us on Facebook to learn more about the organization and explore the benefits of membership. Also, mark your calendars. Our next event is our members meeting on August 7th. We look forward to seeing each member at the meeting. And if you are not a member, we hope that you would consider joining us or at least donate to help us continue with our overall goals and mission of the organization. You can join, renew your membership, or donate via our website at lacreole.org. Please enjoy the rest of your evening, and we look forward to seeing you at our next gathering. Also, word of mouth goes a long way, so share with your family and friends about the program today. And we thank you all from La Creole. Have a good evening.
Thank everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. This was
Thank
terrific.
you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night. Oh, well, good evening.
Or
Bonsoir.
wherever you are. Bonsoir.
Yes, indeed.